So this is something that is probably going to change the way you look at playing guitar more than anything else. It's going to make it so much easier to play whatever you want all across the fretboard and actually make sense of it all. And I think when you really get this, it's so simple. It's ridiculous how simple it is, and it's amazing how much it actually unlocks the fretboard for you or opens up the fretboard for you when you really get what's going on. So let's just go ahead and dive straight in, and we'll see what we got, okay? So this is what I call the Freedom Key, part of the Freedom Key system that you're learning right now. So this is really the key, kind of like the key that unlocks the door or the key to reading the map. Let's put it that way. So far, you should know, and if you don't, you need to go back and do it, but you should know major scales, pattern number 1, pattern number 2, pattern number 3, and pattern number 4. So obviously here we have a picture of major scale pattern number 1. Okay, this should be familiar to you already. You should know what this is. It shouldn't look scary. You should already know major scale pattern 2. Okay, and by the way, these are just charts. Don't worry about what fret these patterns start on. All we're doing here is just looking at a visual representation of the actual patterns, okay? So you should know major scale pattern number 2 as well. You also should know major scale pattern number 3. You should be able to play all these, by the way, okay? Again, if you can't play all these and you don't know what the patterns look like by memory, I really encourage you to go back and practice these patterns until you can play them using the right fingers and making sure that you know you're hitting all the right notes. And you should also know by now pattern number 4. Okay, so at this point, it's probably feeling like, okay, we're learning all these major scale patterns, and we're learning how to connect them all together based on where the patterns start from the 1-string scale. And it might be getting a little confusing at this point to try to keep up with all of these patterns. So what we're about to talk about is really, again, the key. It's what's going to tie everything together and make any pattern that you learn from here on out so much easier to remember and to actually be able to play on your fretboard. So I want you to take a good mental picture of each one of these patterns real quick. And I want you to notice that there are some patterns along one string that repeat or that you see somewhere else in one of the other patterns. So let's say in pattern number 1 here, I'm hovering my mouse around number 1. On the very first string, you see 3 dots, 3 notes, and they each have a space in the middle. Or between each of the dots, there is a fret in the middle. So you see that pattern on one string in other places. For instance, the most obvious place is on the next string. You can also see that if you look at my mouse. You can see that on pattern number 2 over here. You can also see that if you look at my mouse on pattern number 4 down here, and also on pattern number 3, okay? If you look back at pattern number 1, let's look at the 2 middle strings now. Notice how there's 2 dots right next to each other, and then there is 1 dot or 1 note rather with 1 fret in between. There are 2 of these patterns on one string in a row. So we have 2 dots right next to each other, then a space, and then another dot. And we have 2 of those patterns in a row. And if we continue looking at pattern number 1, the very top 2 strings are also the same. They just kind of look like a mirror image of the middle 2 strings that we just talked about. But if you'll notice, on any one string, on any of these patterns, on major scale pattern number 1, on major scale pattern number 2, on major scale pattern number 3, on major scale pattern number 4, there are really only a few different patterns of notes that exist on one string. So that's what we're about to talk about. And here are the 3 different patterns that you see over and over again on one string. So the notes that are spaced out, the 3 notes that are spaced out is what I call a big stretch. Now, it really doesn't matter what you call these patterns. We just want to label. We want to label the patterns so we know what we're talking about and we can communicate the pattern. So the 3 spaced notes are what I call the big stretch. Okay, you're going to use your first finger, you're going to use your middle finger, and then you're going to use your pinky for all the big stretches. Now remember, you can always go back to the very beginning in the introduction. The not the introduction to this lesson, but the introduction at the very beginning of the program to see which fingers to use for each one of these patterns, okay, if you get stuck or if you forget. We also have what I call a middle finger pattern, and that's because we use our first finger, our middle finger, and then our pinky, always. And then we also have what I call a ring finger pattern, which you're going to use, of course, your first finger. One second. You're going to use your first finger, you're going to use your ring finger, and then you're going to use your pinky. So I call that a ring finger pattern. Okay, so here's the cool part. Here's the thing. Each one of these patterns on one string, they always come in, let's say, bundles. And you'll know what I mean by that in just a second. So here they are. The big stretches. Anytime you see big stretches, they always come in threes. So there are always 3 big stretches in a row. Now you may be thinking, well, wait a second. Let's check out, let's look back at pattern 1. Here's major scale pattern number 1. Notice how there are only 2 big stretches in a row, right? But I just said there was 3 in it. There's always 3 in a row. So hold that thought. I'll explain that in just a second. So let's go back to what we call our bundles here. So we're going to be building towards something with this. So just keep paying attention. I promise I'll answer your questions if you have any questions. We always have 3 big stretches in a row. Okay. Anytime we have middle finger patterns, they always come 2 in a row. Always 2 middle finger patterns in a row. Same thing with the ring finger patterns. Okay. There's always 2 ring finger patterns right in a row, one after the other, or on 2 consecutive strings or 2 adjacent strings, if you want to put it that way. So let's take a deeper look with this. But let's kind of analyze pattern number 1 to see how these bundles or these patterns on one string fit within the major scale pattern. So if you notice, at the very beginning of major scale pattern 1, remember this chart is upside down. If you have trouble reading this chart, go back to the introduction section and read the or watch the how to read the scale charts video, and make sure you know exactly the orientation of the chart that we're talking about. So if you watch my mouse here, this note is the very first note on your low E string, meaning the fat string, the lowest sounding string. And then if you watch my mouse again, this note all the way up here to the top right is your highest pitch note. So it's on the high E string, which is the thinnest string on your guitar. Remember, we're talking about sound when we say high and low. We're not talking about location. So I'll just leave it at that. Go back to how to read scale charts if that gets confusing at all. So check this out. At the beginning of major scale pattern number 1, we have 2 big stretches. Remember I said there are always 3 big stretches. Well, here's the thing. If you count each one of these rows for all the bundles, the big stretches, the middle finger pattern, the ring finger pattern, we have 3 big stretches. Okay, that's 3. We have 2 middle finger patterns. 3 plus 2 is 5 so far. And then we also have 2 ring finger patterns. So we've got 3 big stretches plus 2 middle finger patterns plus 2 more ring finger patterns. 3 plus 2 plus 2 is 7. The thing is, we only have 6 strings on our guitar. So one of these patterns on one string has to be left off of the guitar. Or in other words, we're not going to see it. That's why we're only seeing 2 big stretches at the beginning of major scale pattern 1. It just so happens that it's these top 2 big stretches here, and I'll explain why it's the top 2 here in just a second. Let's just keep following along. So if you notice, on major scale pattern number 1, again, it starts with the 2 big stretches, okay? And then if we keep going, the next group or the next bundle or whatever you want to call it is in the middle of pattern number 1 is 2 middle finger patterns, okay? And then the next 2 strings, which are symmetrical as well, we obviously have 2 ring finger patterns after that. Okay, so let's kind of recap here. We have 2 big stretches, followed by 2 middle finger patterns, followed by 2 ring finger patterns. Now, I want you to notice the order that these patterns are going in. We have big stretches, followed by the middle finger pattern, followed by the ring finger patterns. Okay, I'm going to say that one more time. We have big stretches, which are followed by the middle finger patterns, which are followed by the ring finger patterns. So this is going to make up, if we stack all these patterns together, this is going to make what I call the big repeating pattern, or in other words, what I'm about to show you is the freedom key. So it's kind of like the key to reading the map of the guitar neck. And it's, again, when you really understand this, when you really get this, it's kind of mind-blowing how simple it is, but also how powerful it is and how much it actually opens the fretboard, because you can play anywhere and it makes perfect sense. Now, it takes a little bit of practice, of course. You have to actually use your hands and play this stuff on your guitar, but it really is the key that unlocks the whole fretboard for you. So, are you ready? Here it is. This is the whole key right here. And I know it may look confusing at first. You're like, what the heck are all these, dots moving up and down? So actually what we're looking at here, and I'm just going to show you this, is we have 3 big stretches, followed by 2 middle finger patterns, followed by 2 ring finger patterns. Okay, these patterns, the stretches, the middles, the rings, they always occur on the fretboard in this order. Always. And what happens is, now don't let this next slide scare you, but what happens is, I'm going to show you the slide. It's going to look crazy at first, but I'm going to explain it, okay? What happens is, if you look at my mouse down here, let me see if I can draw on the screen, actually. Let's see. So if you look at my mouse, we have the 3 big stretches down here, okay? Followed by the 2 middle finger patterns. And, of course, what's next? We have the 2 ring finger patterns. But guess what? When we just looked at the freedom key, that's where we stopped. The thing is, I call this the big repeating pattern, right? It actually repeats forever and ever and ever. So after the 2 ring finger patterns, we literally just start over. And if you notice where my mouse is, right here, hang on, right here, where the 2 ring finger patterns end and the 3 big stretches start are on the same fret. So again, if we start it over, of course, we have 3 big stretches up here. And then after that, we're running out of room on the screen, but we have 2 middle finger patterns. And if we kept going higher and higher, of course, we would have 2 rings. Then we would start over. We would have 3 big stretches, followed by 2 middle finger patterns, followed by 2 ring finger patterns. 3 big stretches, followed by 2 middle finger patterns, followed by 2 ring finger patterns. And if we go in the opposite direction, in other words, if we go in this direction, you can see how after the 3 big stretches, you can kind of see down here we have the ring finger patterns again. So we're just essentially going backwards. So first of all, I hope that's clear. It's pretty simple how the patterns stack on top of each other. We have the 3 big stretches, followed by the 2 middle finger patterns, followed by the 2 ring finger patterns. The thing is, why is this useful? How are we going to apply all this stuff, on your guitar? How does this actually apply to your fretboard? So in order to answer that question, first of all, what this is going to do for you is, again, allow you to navigate anywhere on the fretboard just from knowing maybe 1 or 2 strings of the major scale patterns. But the thing is, instead of having to memorize all of these patterns, these major scale patterns, which you actually should be doing anyway, this is going to give you a way to actually figure out, no matter where you are on the guitar, you're going to be able to figure out which pattern comes next, no matter if you're going up the strings or down the strings. Now, not up or down the frets, up or down the strings. So across the strings, from your high E string to your low E string, right? Okay. So, one other cool thing about that is eventually, and we're going to get to this a little bit later in a few lessons from now, you're going to be able to use these patterns, the big stretches, the middle finger patterns, the ring finger patterns. You're going to be able to use these across the whole fretboard to actually tie the sound that each pattern makes In other words, you're going to tie the sound of a big stretch to the muscle memory of your fingers to make the big stretch. So whenever you, let's say you're improvising or you're soloing and there's a certain sound you want to hear, well, you're automatically going to know whether that's a ring finger pattern, a middle finger pattern, or a big stretch. And the thing is, eventually, you're not even going to have to think about that. Your hand is just going to do it for you. And that's ultimately where we're going. And by the way, that's, the guys that you see shredding it up on stage or playing those awesome solos on stage, again, they're not thinking about it, right? The sound is connected to their fingers, and as soon as they hear that sound in their head, their fingers do it automatically. And that's where we're trying to get to for you as well. And it will if you just keep going, okay? So let's talk about how does this apply? How does the big repeating pattern apply to your fretboard? So we're going to look at major scale pattern number 2. And before you move on, you can pause the video or whatever you need to do, but look at this major scale pattern on the chart here and make sure you're clear on what this is. This is major scale pattern number 2. You should be able to play this by now, and you should be able to play it from memory, okay? So check this out. We've got, starting on the second string of the pattern, we've got 3 big stretches in a row. Remember how 3 big stretches always come one after the other? Or always come in a bundle, rather? We have 3 big stretches, and guess what? After 3 big stretches, what do we always have? We have 2 middle finger patterns. And if we go backwards to the very first string of major scale pattern 2, we have a ring finger pattern. Now, remember we said ring finger patterns always come in bundles of 2, right? So where's the other one? Well, remember, we only have 6 strings, and if we have 2 ring finger patterns plus 3 big stretches plus 2 middle finger patterns, that's a total of 7. So 7 1 strings. But we only have 6 strings on our guitar. So here's a question I like to ask, which is, if we had an invisible lower string down here, can you guess the 1 string pattern that this string would be? Or in other words, can you guess the pattern on this string? Would it be a big stretch? Would it be a middle finger pattern? Would it be a ring finger pattern? Well, I hope by now, since you always know that ring finger patterns always come in 2s, you can guess that it's the invisible 7th string would be a ring finger pattern. Okay, it's pretty cool, huh? If we went to the other end of the spectrum, if we went to the other side of the guitar neck over here, if we have 2 middle finger patterns, and let's assume we had 2 extra higher invisible strings, kind of where my mouse is right here, can you guess what those next 2 strings would look like? Would they be 2 big stretches? Would they be 2 middles? Would they be 2 ring finger patterns? Well, remember, after 2 ring finger patterns, we always have after 2, let me draw on the screen here. Here we go. After 2 middle finger patterns, we always have 2 more ring finger patterns, which would be up here. Just like that. So these 2, I'll draw it in. These 2 would be ring fingers. All right. I promise it's really hard to draw a circle with a mouse. I'm sure you know. But just so you can see how this works, again, we have the 3 big stretches followed by the 2 middle finger patterns followed by the 2 ring finger patterns. Okay? Now, we've got an interesting thing happening with pattern number 2. If you notice, we have, when we go to the 2 middle finger patterns after the 3 big stretches, we shift up 2 frets, not 1 fret. So what the heck is up with that? Well, if we go back to the big repeating pattern, if we go back to the freedom key here, after 3 big stretches, the key says that we only shift up 1 fret to play the middle finger patterns. So what the heck's going on with pattern number 2? Why do we shift up 2 frets up here? Well, here's the thing, and it has to do with the tuning of your guitar. Don't worry, it's super, super, super easy. We just need to explain it, so you'll always know it. And you've probably noticed that one of your guitar strings is tuned slightly different than the other ones. If you haven't, no worries. Just totally ignore everything that you thought about that before, because this is going to be super easy. Okay. Again, these last two strings here, this is the B string and this is the high E string. So what we're looking at is, why are we shifting up an extra fret for these last two middle finger patterns instead of just shifting up one fret like our freedom key says to do? So only shifts up one fret for the two middles. So why do we do that? Well, it's something I call the warp zone. And it's really, really easy, really, really simple. If you're right-handed, this is going to make sense for right-handed guitar players. If you're left-handed, you're going to have to flip this around as a mirror image. Okay, so the guitar is actually tuned like, it looks like this. What I mean by this, and remember that the low E string, the fattest string that has the lowest sound, is on the bottom of this graph. So as you play, and I'm going to show you a little chart, or a little arrow here in just a second, but as you play something on your guitar, in other words, if you would pick one fret and just play the note on one fret and then stay on the same fret, go to the next string, stay on the same fret, go to the next string, then go to the next string. In order to get the same sound as going from the E string to the A string to the D string to the G string, you would actually, when we got to the B string, you actually have to shift up one fret and then keep playing as you were before. So it makes a little more sense if I draw it like this and I take away that little crummy drawing I just made. So if we're playing up the guitar strings from low pitch to high pitch, as soon as we get to the B string, we have to shift up one fret and then continue playing our patterns. Okay, so if we go back to the big repeating pattern, if we go back to the freedom key, remember we have one fret shift up when we get to the two middle finger patterns. We're only shifting up. After the three big stretches, we're only shifting up one fret to play the two middle finger patterns. So on pattern number 2, on major scale pattern number 2, since we have to shift up one fret on the B string, the warp zone makes us shift up one fret when we get to the B string, which makes, if you look at this blue arrow, that makes these two middle finger patterns shifted up one more fret than where they would normally start, which would be right here. That's why that can kind of be a little bit confusing, but as long as you remember the warp zone, so as long as you remember that, let's say you start here, everything's normal, we play our three big stretches, and then normally we're supposed to go right here to play the two middle finger patterns. Well, guess what? We're on the B string, which means we're in the warp zone. So we have to shift up one more fret and then keep playing as normal. All right, so I know that's a kind of hard to see, but I think that would make a little, or that will make sense to you. Of course, obviously, if you watch this again, but it should make sense already. But if it doesn't, let's go ahead and let's look at a different pattern. So let me get rid of this drawing here. Let's look at major scale pattern number 1 now. So we got another interesting thing happening. After the two middle finger patterns, the two ring finger patterns start on the same fret as the two middle finger patterns did. But if we look at this whole series of patterns right here, which means the two middle finger patterns followed by the two ring finger patterns, they're all on the same fret. They all start on the same fret. But in major scale pattern number 1, we have two middle finger patterns followed by the two ring finger patterns. But if you notice the shape of the little box I'm drawing, doesn't it look exactly like the warp zone? Right? It looks just like that. And I'm going to leave this drawing up because I'm coming back to the slide I was just on. But this blue box, it looks just like this little blue box where the whole pattern is shifted up on the B string and the E string. So let me find this real quick. Here we are again. Yep, back on pattern number 1. Remember the warp zone, since we hit the B string on these two ring finger patterns, that's why this blue arrow is showing that we're shifting up one more fret for the warp zone and continuing to play the big repeating pattern. All right, so remember again, you have to shift up one fret anytime you get to the B string all you're really doing is following the big repeating pattern. Let's say you're starting here and you're playing up the big repeating pattern just as it's drawn. As soon as you get to the B string, actually on your guitar, you have to shift up 1 fret and then continue playing the big repeating pattern. Okay, it's just how your guitar is tuned. I really don't know why, but that's the way it is, so that's the way we're going to do it. Makes life a lot easier when you just accept a few things, as I'm sure you know. Okay, so that was pattern 1 in the warp zone. If you understand how the warp zone works, you're going to be able to see how every major scale pattern you know, so far that's major scale patterns 1, 2, 3, and 4, you're going to be able to see how on the B and E strings, the big repeating pattern is shifted up 1 fret or shifted toward the body of your guitar 1 fret as soon as you hit the warp zone. So that means on the B and the E strings. So this may be confusing. I would actually encourage you, even if it does make perfect crystal clear sense, I would actually turn this video as soon as it's done, start it over, watch it all again, because you really want to be crystal clear about all this. Okay, so what does all this mean? Why are we even talking about this stuff? Well, okay, by using the big repeating pattern and accounting for the warp zone on the B and E strings, of course, you should be able to figure out the rest of, meaning the remaining strings of any major scale pattern just from knowing the first 2 or 3 strings. That's because the big repeating pattern always follows the same pattern over and over again. It's always 3 big stretches followed by 2 middle finger patterns followed by 2 ring finger patterns. Then 3 big stretches, 2 middle finger patterns, then 2 ring finger patterns. When you apply the big repeating pattern or the freedom key to the fretboard, all you have to do is account for the warp zone, meaning when you get down to the B string, just shift toward the body of your guitar, which is up in pitch, just shift up 1 fret and then continue playing the big repeating pattern as normal. So now, here I have the big repeating pattern again. We have the 3 big stretches followed by 2 middles, followed by 2 rings, starting over the 3 big stretches, followed by 2 middles, followed by 2 rings, starting over the 3 big stretches, and so on and so on. So now what I want you to do is actually analyze each major scale pattern that you know to see, number 1, how each major scale pattern follows the big repeating pattern. Okay, you're going to see where it starts, where each one of the major scale patterns start in reference to the big repeating pattern. And you're also going to notice and observe and see how each one of the major scale patterns enters the warp zone on the B string. So you're going to see how the big repeating pattern gets shifted up 1 fret or 1 fret toward the body of your guitar on the B string and then continues to the E string. Now this is going to take a little bit of practice. That's totally fine. I really encourage you to do it and to stick with it until it makes perfectly crystal clear sense of what's happening within each of the major scale patterns that you know. And from now on, you're always going to be able to use this to play anywhere on the guitar neck, to play any other major scale patterns that we're going to learn. And as you're going to see later in future lessons, we're also going to use this same concept to see how you can actually start the big repeating pattern from any string and not just the low E string. So I hope you enjoyed that. Please go back to the very beginning, watch this again, and when you're crystal clear on what to do, I'll see you in the next exercise.